All right. Hey, everybody. Let's see. Let me make sure everything, yep, okay. Looks to be working. We're getting sound. All right. And good. Okay. Excellent. Looks like everything's good to go. So far, our in-person folks looks like haven't been able to join us today, so it's just us digital chickens this time. That's all right. And I'm glad you're here. Hang on, let me switch. Good. So my name's Nathan Smith. I'm the Digital Programming Coordinator here at the Central Arkansas Library System. And this is Microsoft Excel Part 4, which is Pivot Tables, Pivot Charts, and Lookup. I'm excited to share this with you. This is a particularly fun one. There's a lot of really interesting stuff that you can do with pivot tables and pivot charts. And so I'm excited to show you what you can do. Before we dive in, of course, the usual preliminary things. First of all, I do want to mention if you have questions, my philosophy about questions is that you should ask them. Don't worry about whether you're interrupting. Don't worry about if it might seem like a silly question. None of that stuff matters. What matters is if you have a question, that question gets asked so it can get answered. Because otherwise, you might lose the thread of what we're talking about. Just by being distracted or because you didn't understand something I said and didn't ask about it. So I want to make sure folks are keeping up with where we are, and the best way to do that is, of course, to ask those questions when they arise. Sorry, I noticed my camera's doing something weird. There we go. Cool. Okay, so ask those questions. Put them in chat if you are here with us in Zoom, or if you're watching on YouTube. If you're watching on Facebook, put them in the comments. I'll see those as well. And we'll make sure that they get addressed. Another big thing is I'll go ahead and drop the link to the example files and the handout in the chat. So that way y'all can see that. If you want to follow along, you can find all that stuff there. If you don't want to follow along and you'd prefer to just sort of watch, that's totally fine too. That's not a bad strategy, and you can always circle back to the CAL's YouTube channel later on and watch the recording, so you can follow along then. The recording is going to be, the CAL's YouTube channel can be found at, if you're not already there, cals.link/YouTube, and I'll go ahead and put that in the chat as well. And let's see. So, last thing, if there are technical problems, please let me know as soon as possible. We have had some problems with our mics in the last couple of days, so I want to make sure that that doesn't happen again, or if it does, at least that I know about it so I can fix it quickly. I've made one adjustment to our configuration here, which I hope will be all that's needed in order to resolve it, but absolutely glad to do it. Hopefully that mic change will be the only thing we need to adjust, but if not, then we'll adjust it at that time. We'll roll with the punches. Okay, let's go ahead and dive in. So today's session, as I said, Part 4, Pivot Tables, Pivot Charts, and Lookup. Basically, the idea behind this session, well, it's pretty much laid out for you. That not only is that the title, it's also the outline. So first of all, we're going to be talking about pivot tables. Pivot tables are really cool. We're gonna spend probably the majority of our class time talking about pivot tables. Basically, pivot tables are sort of a way of viewing your data from different angles and kind of connecting your data together in interesting and useful ways. So we're going to do a ton with that. It's not hard, but there is a lot to talk about, and I certainly want you to get a pretty full picture of pivot tables because they're fantastic. So that's the first part. We're going to talk briefly then about pivot charts. Pivot charts are kind of, well, they're basically taking the information that you get from a pivot table and they are adding it in and they're rolling it into a chart. So you can see the information that you pulled out from the pivot table represented via the pivot table represented visually. Finally, we're going to talk about the Vlookup function in Excel formulas. Vlookup is basically a way to have Excel look up information from another part of your workbook or another sheet, and we're going to do that. And that's also going to serve as kind of some final reminders about best practices for formulas, which obviously is super important. So that's about it. Let's go ahead and actually open up the example file and get it rolling. If you've downloaded the example file, then all you'll need to do is just double click it to open it on up inside of Excel. I, here in the classroom, am going to go to my Microsoft Excel in the classroom files folder, double click on that part4.xlsx. Again, if you're downloading it online, yours will be named something very different. Well, it might say part 4 at the beginning, but then it'll be a long string of characters, and that's okay. It's not a virus or anything. It's the file. It's just the service that I'm using to host those renames your files in kind of funny or annoying ways depending on the situation and what you think of it. Okay, so let's go ahead and dive into our first example. So actually, even before we get to pivot tables, we need to talk for a few minutes about what regular tables are. Tables in Excel are really handy in and of themselves, and they're a really good thing to know about if you're going to be using pivot tables. So let's talk about them first. Okay, here on this sheet I haven't updated it since about a year and a half ago, but what this is a list of Marvel movies and a list of Star Wars movies, and they're written out in the same format with title, release date, director, and writer listed there. And what I want to do with this in this example is I want to, let's say that I'm going to see the movies in in order by their release date or something of that nature. Actually, I guess I already have it that way. Let's say I want to see them in alphabetical order just by title, right? If that's the case, what I'm going to do is if that's the case, we saw in part 1 how we could turn on the sort of sort and filter thing, and so if I go up to sort and filter and click on that and click filter, it's going to give me these little drop down boxes where I can sort based on each column header, right? So for example, again, going by title, I can click here and I can click sort A to Z, and that should give me an alphabetical list of titles. But when I do that, you'll notice that I have kind of a problem here. The problem is the movies have been sorted based on title, but not only that, the word title has been sorted into the mix, and we have the two sets of movies mixed up with each other. So there's a problem. We wanted to keep them separate, but now they're together. Let me show you the reason for that. I'm going to hit undo up here at the top really quick. The reason for that is that we have these listed kind of right next to each other in this, on this sheet, right together. And one other thing to mention is if I were to print this out, or if I were to look at this on certain monitors or with certain text sizes, it's going to kind of be hard to read. So what I want to do, I want to avoid mixing up the two sets of movies, and I want to make this a little easier to read and a little easier to sort out, basically. So let's do that. What I'm going to do is I'm going to turn each set of data into a table. So I'm going to come up to the top and start with cell A1 where it says title. Hold down with my mouse and drag until I have all the cells selected down to cell D24, which says Chris McKenna and Eric Summers, just for reference. I've got all of that selected. That's all the Marvel movies and their information. So now what I want to do is I'm going to go up to the top. And here on the Home tab, this is probably the easiest place to do it. I'm going to click on this button that says Format as Table. And I'm going to either choose, and I'm going to choose one of these options here. Now, it doesn't really matter what I choose. These are all sort of just aesthetic differences. So I can make it look a variety of different ways, but it's going to have the same functionality. So you can choose whichever of these appeals to you the most. But let's start with, I'll do green for this one. So I'm going to click on this green one right here. And then it says Format as Table. Where is the data for your table? And the option, and it's filled in for me already the cells I previously had selected. So cells A1 to D24. And again, you'll notice we've got the dollar signs in there, $A, $1, colon, $D, $24. And those, as we mentioned the last couple of days, those are what we call absolute references. So it's basically just telling Excel, like, it's exactly these cells, and don't change it. And then there's a check mark under here that says my table has headers. You should leave that checked if, your table has headers, which ours does. We've got title, release date, director, writer. So we do have headers. I'm going to click OK. Excuse me. Oh, I forgot I was going to do that. Sorry, y'all. A little tickle in the back of my throat there. OK. I got to remove the filtering first. So I'm going to come up here, go to Sort and Filter again, click the little filter funnel, and that gets rid of the filtering. So now I can just select it again. Whoop. Format as Table. Click the green one here, and then leave it as the default options that come up. I'll click OK. And now I've got this. This is not exactly what I wanted, so I can change the style if I want to. You'll notice up here at the top it says Table Tools Design, and I've got a bunch of options here, which we'll talk about in a minute. The first option that I want to use is I'm going to, over here where it says Table Styles, I'm going to click this More button right here. And I'm going to pick a style that has what we call banded rows, where it alternates the colors of the rows for more readability. So I'm going to click on the version that has banded rows. And there we go. Now we've got a nice little setup for our tables. OK, so let's talk about what's going on here. Number one, the cells we had selected have this little zebra stripe effect, the banded rows. So it's easier to read, particularly if you're printing. This makes it a lot easier to read when you've got the banded rows there. So that's kind of nice. Then you'll notice another thing. We have our little drop-down arrows back where we can sort and filter. But if I were to sort based on title again, this time, it's only going to sort inside of the table. So I don't have to worry about my Marvel movies here getting mixed in with my Star Wars movies or whatever I want to do. I can make sure that, that the data inside the table I can play with however I want to, but the data outside the table is basically going to be ignored. That's a good thing. Then another thing you'll notice as I scroll up and down here, up at the top, instead of having column A, column B, column C, and column D, they still are those columns, of course, but the headers for your table actually replace your column letters at the top here as you scroll down. So that way, it's easier to remember exactly what data you're looking at because your column header is always right there with you. So that's really, really handy, and that'll stay up there until I scroll past the table entirely. At that point, it goes back to the normal column letters. So there's a few other things you can do inside a table that are really handy. First of all, you can name a table, just like we named on Tuesday. We named that cell that had the length of time that our breakout sessions were going to last. We named it length so we could refer to it in the formula. Here, you can name this table so that if if Excel asks you for a range of cells in a formula, or if you need to refer to a range of cells in a formula, rather than saying A1 to D24 or whatever it is, you can just you can go over here, or you can put in table 1 instead, or whatever you want to name it as. If you left some data out of your table that you should have included, there's a resize table button here, and you can use that to resize the table, right? Next to that are three very useful buttons that I'll point out really quickly. First of all, summarize with pivot table, which we'll come back to, as you might imagine. There's also remove duplicates right here, so you can remove the duplicates from within the table very easily just by, clicking that. And then there's convert to range. If you want your cells not to be a table anymore, you click convert to range, and then the table, everything stays the way it was, but the table just disappears and it goes back to being regular cells. There are a few other options here. We won't go into all of that. You can change the style over here by checking or unchecking these various boxes, and so on and so forth. So that's some useful stuff about tables. If I want to, I can come down here. I'll select from cell A25 to D36, format as table, and then I'll choose, say, the yellow one. Click OK. And now I have two tables. I've got a Marvel table up here and a Star Wars table down here. Great. And of course, I can sort them independently. If I want Star Wars movies sorted by director, and I want Marvel movies sorted by writers, then I can totally do that. Great. Okay, so that's tables in a nutshell. They're not super complicated. There's not a ton to them, but they're definitely worth knowing about. Now, why did I mention that at the beginning of our pivot table discussion? Because pivot tables, if you've ever seen a pivot table, you know it's kind of different from this. The reason that I mention that is turning your data into a regular table before you make it into a pivot table is a really good practice to use. The reason for that is, well, there are a couple of different reasons. But it's what we're going to do at the start, and then I'll kind of tell you why as we move forward a little more. So to start out, though, I'm going to click on the order list sheet down at the bottom here. This order list sheet, what we've got is a list of fake orders from fake customers to our fake company, and over the course of 2018 and 2019. What I want to do is I want to change this, or is I want to take this data set and I want to analyze it using pivot tables. To do that, I want to turn it into a table first, like I discussed a moment ago. So to do that, I'm going to I've got to select all the cells. Unfortunately, all the cells that have data in them on this particular sheet, well, there's 1,001 of them if you include the header row. That's a lot. So rather than try and drag down 1,000 rows and make sure we're in the right column and everything, I'm going to show you a little shortcut. Okay, on your keyboard, or on my keyboard, what I'm going to do is hold Control and Shift. Now, if you're on a Mac, to be really, really honest with you, I have no idea what the equivalent is going to be. Shift should be the same, but you might have to play around with Command and Function and Alt in order to get the right combination of keys. But on a PC, on a Windows computer, I'm going to hold Control, press Shift, or hold Control and Shift, and while I'm holding those, I'm going to hit the right arrow key on my keyboard. What that's going to do is it's going to it's going to select all the cells there on row 1 from A1 all the way over to N1, where we have where our column headers stop, basically. Cell O1 doesn't have anything in it. And then we're going to get the rest of the cells down to where the empty cells start. So we're going to go down to 1001. And the easy way to do that is the same way. We're going to do Control Shift, and this time we're going to press down on the arrow keys. When I do that, lo and behold, I now have cells A1 to N1001 selected. Pretty easy. If for some reason something happened and you didn't get all the cells selected and you're now at the bottom of this, you can just do the reverse pretty easily too. I'll select cell N1001 right here, hold Control and Shift, press the left arrow key and press the up arrow key, and that'll get me where I need to go. So you hold Control and Shift and then use the arrow keys, and it'll select only cells that have data in them. All right, so we've got all our data selected. Now what I'm going to do is, I'm going to turn it into a table, just like I showed you a moment ago. So I'm going to come to the top where it says Format as Table, click on that, and then I've got, again, my various style options. I'm going to choose the orange one this time, because why not? Where's the data for your table? A1 to N1001. Yep, that's correct. My table has headers. Yes, it does. I'll click OK. When you're putting your data together for a pivot table, okay. So we now have our regular table. We're ready to turn it into a pivot table in just a second. But I'm going to go ahead and mention some other things. In addition to creating a table at the start, I'm going to go ahead and mention some other things that you probably want to do before you start trying to turn your data into a pivot table, or before you actually make the pivot table. The first thing is, I definitely recommend you have headers for your data. If you don't, make some up so that you understand what's going on, because otherwise you're going to have like column 1, column 2, column 3, and that's going to get really confusing. You got to describe your data with some sort of headers. So make sure that's there, and of course do that before you turn it into a table, because then it's more hassle to make it into a table. Secondly, you do want to make it into a table, just like we talked about. And then third, you want to try and avoid blank cells as much as possible. So make very, very sure that you don't have just purely blank rows or blank columns inside your data. If you do, go ahead and get rid of those. If you have a blank column and you need to collapse it, you can right-click at the top on the column letter and click Delete, and it will get rid of that blank column. No problem. Blank rows, same deal. Come over here, right-click on the row number and click Delete. And you can select multiple and delete multiple rows or multiple columns that way. So, but in addition to blank rows and blank columns, which really confuse pivot tables, the other thing you want to do is avoid blank cells as much as possible. Normally, in a lot of situations, I would just leave some cells blank if I don't have any data to put there. But in the case of a pivot table, I'm going to have to be extra mindful of what the pivot table will consider data and what it won't. So in order to make my data as compatible with pivot tables as possible, I want to go through and find those blank cells, and I want to put something there. Now, what I put there, what you put there is going to depend on what kind of data you're working with. So if you've got a blank cell because, like, I don't know, say, you're tracking assignments and there are, X number of cases that don't have people assigned to work them yet, then you might have those as a blank cell. But for pivot table purposes, you probably want to do something like put NA or none or something like that in place of the person who would normally be assigned the work. If you're doing something like this, tracking orders or things like that, and there were some orders that were free, somebody got somebody redeemed a free cupcake or whatever, then don't leave that as a blank cell, make it a 0, because really the price of the order was $0. It wasn't nothing, it was $0 for Excel's terminology. So try to figure out ways to avoid having blank cells. Zeros, not applicable, none, or just fixing errors, because sometimes a cell is blank because somebody forgot to fill it in. Once you've done that, you've kind of cleaned up your data a little bit. You can turn it into a table just like we did. And then up at the top in this Table Tools Design tab, we have Summarize with Pivot Table right here. You can also do it from the Insert tab if you click on Insert, and then you apparently wait forever on my computer. Come on, computer. Ah! Oh boy. All right. Oh, yay. Okay. Thank you. Good job, Excel. You survived. You did it. You can also click Pivot Table there, and that'll work too, particularly if all your cells are selected. You might have to, if you click that, yeah, okay. Because it's in a table, it just fills in Table 3, and that's good. So it doesn't matter which one you choose, either Summarize with Pivot Table on that Table Tools Design tab, or Pivot Table over here on the Insert tab. Don't click Recommended Pivot Tables. That's something slightly different, which we'll get back to. Okay, so it pops up with this Create Pivot Table dialog box. I will mention in the very newest versions of Excel, this dialog box is slightly streamlined. So you still have the same options as far as I'm aware, but you don't have to choose quite so many things in this box. I will go ahead and tell you we're going to use all the default options right here, but let's talk just briefly about what these are, because that'll give you some idea of some other stuff that pivot tables can do that we're not necessarily going to be talking about today. So first of all, choose the data that you want to analyze. Select a table or range, and then in this case it picked table 3, which is what we want. That's the table that's down here that's the table that we created here out of our order list. Next, there's an option to use an external data source if we prefer, rather than selecting a table or range. If we use an external data source, it's a whole other ball of wax. We're definitely not going to get into that today. But you can connect your, workbook to a database that's stored on a website somewhere, or a Microsoft Access database, things like that. There's a lot of stuff you can do there if you have a mind to, and if you're willing to put in the work to figure out how that works. To be really honest with you, I have not been willing to put in that work so far. I could do it if I wanted to, but I don't care. Your mileage may vary. Then there's choose where you want the pivot table report to be placed. And then there's new worksheet or existing worksheet. For the love of all that is holy, choose new worksheet. Because if you choose existing worksheet, it's going to get very complicated and weird looking very quickly, because your pivot table is going to get mixed up with all your other data, or you're going to have to scroll in order to get to the pivot table in the first place. It's a whole mess. Don't do it. Use new worksheet, unless you just created a worksheet that's specifically for the pivot table, and then you put it on that one. That's That's the only scenario where existing worksheet is a good idea for this. Okay. Choose whether you want to analyze multiple tables. And then there's a checkbox that says add this data to the data model. Do not check that checkbox this time. But if you add multiple tables of data with different information but the same structure, very important, the same structure, not different structure. So if I had a list of orders but I only had half these columns, it's not going to work. Then you can add the data to the data model, and the pivot table can analyze all that data at once. I'll click OK, though. We're just going to use the options that were already there, and that's going to create our pivot table on a new sheet that's creatively named Sheet 1. OK. Let's go ahead and play around with our pivot table for a few minutes. And then, no, let's go ahead and talk about this really quick. Get it out of the way. Okay, up at the top we have two new tabs. The Pivot Table Tools Analyze tab and the Pivot Table Tools Design tab. The Design tab is exactly what it sounds like. It's going to change mostly aesthetic options for your pivot tables. We're really not going to go there so much, but you could do banded rows, kind of like we did with the regular tables earlier. Banded columns, column headers, row headers. You can add subtotals in certain places or grand totals. Report layout, you can change the report layout. You can add blank rows. You can do all that stuff. We're not going to do any of that stuff. We're going to leave all this on the Design tab as it is, or at least I'm going to. On the Analyze tab, though, we have some more interesting options that I definitely want to just briefly draw your attention to. A few of these are, there's slicers and timelines, which kind of allow you to analyze specific parts of data even more closely. We're not necessarily really going to get into that, but just know that that's up there. Oh, so someone's saying they don't see these options up at the top. If you created your pivot table and then you clicked out of it, like into a cell over here, that stuff's probably going to disappear. On your sheet with your pivot table, make sure you select cell A3 and kind of just leave your selection there for the most part. That should give you this sidebar, and it should give you the top, it should give you the pivot table settings tabs up at the top. If you still don't see those, if you don't have anything up there, then you might, oh, you got it. Okay, good. All right. Sometimes I feel like once a course, I'll go ahead and point this out too, though. I feel like once a course, somebody accidentally loses their whole ribbon up here, and they don't have the tabs and they don't have the buttons, or at least they don't have the buttons. If that happens, there's a little button over here next to your standard, you have your standard X and the little restore down or maximize button and the little line button that minimizes the window. Next to that, you have this button right up here at the top, which is the ribbon display options. If I click on that, then that's going to show me, I can either auto hide the ribbon, show tabs, or show tabs in commands. So just know that that's a thing. Actually, let me, for folks watching the streams, let me go ahead and hide my camera and show you that button really quick. It's right here. Auto hide ribbon will roll everything up to the very top. Show tabs will show just the tabs but not the buttons. And then show tabs and commands shows all of it like we normally are seeing. Karen on Facebook, thank you so much for being here, and you're very welcome. Okay, we've got. I'm glad you found that. That's good. Yes, thank you. Please, if you run into a problem, please let me know about that too. I definitely want to make sure that we tackle that. So, underneath this, or on this Analyze tab, we've also got Refresh and Change Data Source. And these are very important. This is why I had us turn our data into a table before we made it into a pivot table. Because what this Refresh button does is whenever let's say I went over here to the order list and I made some changes to my data. I'm not actually going to make changes, and I don't necessarily recommend that you do either. But let's say that I did that. I needed to update it. If I just make changes to existing cells that have data in them, like I changed someone's address to be the correct one, or I went back and looked at the invoice and the amount is written down wrong for one of these orders and I correct that, or whatever. Those sorts of things. In those sorts of situations, if I hit refresh, that's all I need to do to make my pivot table, to update my pivot table with that new information. If, however, I just make the changes and I don't come in here and click refresh, it's not going to update. Even if I save my workbook, close Excel, restart my computer, and then come back and do it, it's still not going to update. The only time that your pivot table, that the data that the pivot table is working with is going to update is if you click this refresh button. So make sure that you do that if you make changes to the source data for your pivot tables. It's not going to do it automatically. And that's because basically Excel stores a sort of a snapshot of that data that your pivot table is working with at the time you create your pivot table. I forget what they call that. There's like a specific name for it, a little jargony name that they have for that snapshot of your data, but I don't remember what it is, and it's not that important. But you can, but the important thing to know is if you make updates to your data, you need to come over here to the Pivot Table Tools Analyze tab and click refresh. Okay, so that's if you make changes or little corrections to your data. But let's say that I had 50 new rows of data. There was another salesperson. I was waiting on them to report their numbers, and now they've got me their numbers, and I'm ready to put it in my order list over here. If I do that, could be a problem, because when I click refresh, by default, Excel is only going to refresh the data that's in the cells that are already part of the source data for the pivot table. So basically, like you're looking at, so it's still looking at basically cells A1 to N1001 on my other sheet. However, because I have it in a table, because I didn't go directly from just regular cells to a pivot table, but I have it in a table instead, I can actually go in and I can add additional rows to the table pretty easily. So I'll come down here if I want to put it, I could put it anywhere because I can sort this data anytime I want to. But I can come down here, and if I want to, and then I can click on one of these cells, and I can go insert table row below, or table rows above is probably the better way, because I think row below is just going to add one. But if I do table rows above, oh, it's still only going to add one. Yeah. So the easiest way to do this, actually, I usually don't demonstrate how to add rows to a table, but I realized I probably should. Okay, I've got my cursor somewhere in this table. I'm going to come up to my Table Tools Design tab, and what I would do is click Resize Table. And then I would just change this from A1 to N1001 to, if I had 50 more rows, it'd be A1 to N1051, right? But I'll click Cancel for now. So all I need to do is add those extra rows to my table, put the data into the table, and then because specifically I'm using the table as my source data for my pivot table, I can then come over here and click Refresh. Whereas if I was just using plain cells, I would have to click Change Data Source, and I would have to tell it, hey, Excel, look in not A1 to N1001, look in A1 to N1051. And the reason for that is it would not be part of the table. Where Excel is drawing my information from is not specific cells, it's the table. And so I'm able to just pull directly from the table, and if the table changes sizes, then the pivot table automatically gets it. Oh yeah, that's part of it too. Okay, cool. Get on in here. So all that to say, you should definitely make it a table before you make it a pivot table. There's other stuff you can do here, pivot charts, which we'll talk about shortly, and then recommended pivot tables, which we'll talk about in a few minutes too, just briefly. We'll touch on that. I'm going to come up to the top though, and for me personally, because I've got here in the classroom, I'm using a really large text size on the screen in order to make sure everybody can see, even if they're here in the back of the classroom. Because of that, I'm going to get my tabs and my commands here out of the way by going to that button I just showed you and clicking Auto Hide Ribbon. So that's going to get the whole thing pretty much out of the way, except for this tiny bar at the top that I can click on if I need those tools. Because we're just going to focus for now on the pivot tables themselves, the pivot table itself. So okay, over here on the left, I've got my sheet pretty much as normal, except for this box that says Pivot Table 1. To build a report, choose fields from the pivot table field list. On the other side, I have this sidebar right here. Now again, as I mentioned earlier, if I click outside of this little box, or once the pivot table building gets started, if I click outside of the pivot table itself, then I'm going to lose that sidebar. But it'll come right back if I click somewhere in this box or somewhere in the pivot table. The safest place to put your selection is on cell A3, because that's the top left corner of where the pivot table starts generally. Okay, so let's do the thing. Over here we have our pivot table fields list, and this probably looks familiar. These are just the column headers for our source data that we were working with over on the other sheet, right? So pivot table fields, to start with at least, are just going to be the columns of data that you have. Later on, it's going to expand a little bit more, and we'll talk about that when it happens. But for now, these are just the columns from our other sheet. I'm going to first take the amount field or column, and I'm going to hold my mouse down on it, hold my mouse button down, and I'm going to drag down until I get this under where it says values. And then I'm going to let go of the mouse button to drop it in there. And it should say sum of amount right down here in the corner. So pivot table fields, and then we have sum of amount down here. What was I about to say? Oh yes, sorry. So this is super duper important. Oh my goodness. If you hear nothing else that I say, please pay attention to what I am about to tell you about pivot tables. This is the thing that unlocked it for me. For a long time, I didn't understand pivot tables, and I didn't use them. But eventually, I had to write the material for this class, and so I had to learn how to use pivot tables. And this is the thing that made it go from what to oh. When you're creating a pivot table, the very first thing that you want to do after you make the pivot table is you want to take some numerical value. So in this case, amount is literally the amount of dollars that our fake customers paid for their orders. You want to take some field, some column with the numerical values, and you want to drag it down underneath this corner where it says values right here. If you do that, then your pivot table is going to work great, and you can do all kinds of cool stuff with it. If you don't do that, it might be a problem. Your pivot table at best is probably going to be basically incomprehensible. So always put something with a numerical value under this values field area. So that's the first thing. That's the number one thing. If you hear nothing else about pivot tables, that's what I want to tell you today is put something numerical underneath that values field. Everything else follows a lot more easily from there. Because here's what we're doing with pivot tables. Okay, you'll notice once I drag that down, this changed over here, and I actually have some useful information from this already, with basically just one change to the pivot table configuration. Sum of amount, and then it says 100,253,922.8. What that is $100,253,922.80. That's the grand total of the revenue from all of those orders over on the order list sheet. So we've already learned something. Our total revenue over those 2 years was $100,253,922.80. Great. So already we're on the way to learning something. But the real value in pivot tables comes from what happens next. Because basically when you're using a pivot table, what you're doing is you're taking a big old pile of stuff and you're dividing it up into a bunch of other piles of stuff that are all labeled. So let me show you what I mean. Let's say, okay, so in this order list sheet, we have orders from the US and we have orders from Canada. Let's say we want to figure out how much of our order, how many of our orders are coming, or what proportion of our orders or our revenue is coming from Canada versus the US, right? All I need to do in order to make that happen is come back over here under the pivot table fields, find the country field, and I'm going to drag that down underneath, let's say, columns to start with. When I do that, my pivot table expands pretty significantly. So rather than just sum of amount and then the $100 million like we had over here, we now have 2 additional columns and a grand total column. The first column is CA, the Canada column. And in the Canada column, it says $28,896,448.40. And then in the US column, we have $78,357,474.40. So those are the total orders from Canada and the US respectively. So now we've learned something else about our business. Now we know about 4/5 of our business comes from the US and the other 1/5 of our business comes from Canada. Great. Okay, so let's break it down even more. We now have our Canada pile of money and our US pile of money. So let's break those down by dates and see what we get there. What I'm going to do is I'm going to come up here and I'm going to find the date field at the top, drag that down underneath where it says rows. And now in our date field we have, well, frankly, we have a mess over here. Now, as I mentioned previously, in a couple of the sessions, the version of Excel that I'm working with here in the classroom is old. It's the 2013 version of Excel. However, there's not that many differences between the 2013 version of Excel and the 2022 version, which I think is probably the newest version. Yeah, I'm seeing in the chat, you've got 2018 and 2019. Yeah, so the newer versions work pretty much the same. However, there's a difference here that I definitely want to call out. If you're following along with me and you're on a newer version of Excel, you're not going to see this. You're going to see something that we'll have to do. You're going to see a change that I'm going to have to do manually, and I'm going to show you how to do it. Because what happened here, when I dragged date down under these rows, what happened was I had a list of, it gave me a whole bunch of rows in my pivot table here. I've got, essentially, I have a row for each date that has an order associated with it. Now, if you notice, there's, there are certain dates that are skipped here. So if I go, so I've got 1-1, 1-2, 1-3, 1-4, 1-5, 1-6, and then 1-8. There's no 1-7, January 7th row here. And that's because no orders were placed on January 7th back in my data set. So it's skipping over dates that it doesn't have. That's something. But it's still giving me a lot more information, too much information for a human brain to reasonably pull anything meaningful from. So what I want to do is I want to group this up a little bit and incidentally replicate what you're seeing if you're in Excel 2016 and onward. The way I'm going to do that is I'm going to right-click on one of these dates, doesn't matter which one, and I'm going to come over here and click on Group in the menu. By the way, if you're on a laptop and you're following along and you have like a touchpad rather than a mouse, whenever I say right-click, you can tap with 2 fingers on the touchpad, and that will work in exactly the same way as right-clicking with a traditional mouse. Like, I forgot to turn my camera back on. A traditional mouse like this. Okay, cool. So I clicked with the right mouse button on my dates here, and I've got, and I clicked Group, and now I have this grouping dialog box that's popped up for me. I can change which dates I start and end with, but I'm not going to do that here. There is a different way to do that that is a better option that I'll show you later. But we also have down here this box that says By, and then has different denominations of time: seconds, minutes, hours, days, months, quarters, and years. What I want to do is I'll leave months highlighted here, but I'm also going to click on quarters and years and click OK. When I do that, I suddenly get something that's a little more orderly and makes a little more sense. I have well, let's start over here by looking underneath where it says rows. Underneath where it says rows, you'll notice I now have 3 different pivot table fields. The one on the top is years, and then the next one is quarters, and then the next one is just date. So let's look at how that shows up over here in the actual pivot table. In the actual pivot table, I have 3 sets of rows kind of nested inside each other. There's rows, and there's like sub-rows, and there's like sub-rows. So the main rows are the year rows, and this is the 2018 year row. In terms of the, sounds like I'm talking about a Greek sandwich, but this is the 2018 year row. And it takes up a lot of Excel rows, right? And then it has 4 sub-rows underneath it, 1 for each quarter. Quarter 1, quarter 2, quarter 3, and quarter 4 down there. And then inside of those sub-rows are sub-rows, 1 for each month of that quarter. So the Q1 sub-row has 3 sub-rows, 1 for January, 1 for February, and 1 for March. And then underneath those, I can see each additional, or I can see totals for those particular months in each country. So when I look at this, like, let's say I come down here and I click on September, this particular cell right here is in, you'll notice, the Canada column, and is on the September row inside the 2018 row. What that tells me is that in Canada, in September of 2018, we had $465,186.80 in revenue from all of our orders. Whereas in the US, during that same month, September 2018, we had, let's see, $3,126,000. Whoa, gosh, yeah. I'm getting a bigger screen in here soon. Let me actually zoom in a smidge because you probably need it. Let's see. There we go. Boom. And click back over here. There. Okay, great. All right, so in that same quarter, or in that same month, September of 2018, we had, let's see now, $3,126,456.20 worth of revenue in the US rather than in Canada. So it's very easy to, it's very easy to break this down and get down to some really meaningful numbers using pivot tables. Another thing that we can do here that might actually make this, that might help me some, it might help some of y'all as well, is we can change the way that these numbers are displayed. If I right-click on one of these numbers in the middle, or if I click over here on sum of amount, and click either way, if I click on value field settings, then it's going to give me this little dialog box right here. And we'll come back to this here in a few minutes, but for now, we don't need to worry about it. For now, I'm actually just going to click number format in the corner of this box. And after an interminable wait, it's going to give me this format cells box. We didn't look at this in part 1, but we could have when we talked about number formatting. This is basically what happens when you're choosing a number format in the little drop-down box. If you click more number formats or whatever it is at the bottom, this is the box that you get. So you can change exactly how your numbers are or whatever data is displayed. I'm going to go down to currency right here and click on that on the left. And then I'm just going to click OK because the default is fine. And then I'm going to click OK one more time in this value field settings box. And when I do that, now I can read my numbers a little bit better. And I can tell $3,126,456.20. That's a lot easier to read with the commas and the decimal points. So that way you can change the way that your numbers are displayed. And of course, if you have different types of numbers, if it's not supposed to be dollar amounts, it's supposed to be something else, you can always change that. No big deal. Okay, so that is your... So we've kind of built, well, we built something pretty good here. One other thing that we need to deal with, though, is this, before we start pivoting a little bit more, is this filters area here. So far, we've seen how you create columns, how you create rows. We also need to deal with these filters. So let's say that I want to, well, a really easy, convenient way to do this is actually to take my new years field that I have here. Now, remember, this years field was created by grouping our dates together so that we have basically, whereas before we had one date field, we now actually have a quarters field and a years field too. And those are just based on the data that was in the date column. So I'm going to take the years field and I'm just going to drag it up from the rows area to the filters area. And now when I do that, my layout actually hasn't changed that much. I still have, I still have quarters, and then I still have a sub row underneath each of those quarters for each month that's in the quarter. But now up at the top it says years, and then in parentheses it says all. If I click on that drop-down arrow, then I can choose before 2018, which is none of the data, so I don't want to choose that. After January 1st, after January 1st, 2020, I don't want to choose that because that's not any of the data either. Or 2018 and 2019. So let's choose 2019. I'm going to click that. If I wanted to select both years at the same time, I could. Well, in this case, I could just click all. But if I had a bunch of different years and I wanted to select multiple, I can check this box. And then each of the years turns into a checkbox so that I can check or uncheck them. But in this case, I'm just going to choose 2019 and I'll click OK. So now it says years 2019. And this is going to show me only the 2019 data. So when I look down here, I now have, April of 2019, we had $559,745.60. That's the total amount that I paid, or that customers in Canada paid us for their orders in April of 2019. There's one little pitfall with this, which is if I go back up here and I do choose all, in some other situations, it might make more sense. But in this, it's kind of weird because now this same cell says $1,751,979.60. And what that is that's the total of orders from Canada in April 2018 and April 2019. So, the reason that that's happening is basically you've got your, the reason that that's happening is the data from both years has been combined together. So basically you've got, well, it's looking for column or for rows where Canada is the country and there's a date in April, but it doesn't matter which year April it is. So just be mindful of that. Like, you know, once you add the filters in, just be aware of how your data might be read because, you know, you might hand this to someone and they would say, oh, wow, we did a lot of business in Canada back in April last year. But it's not last year, or this year, it's 2 separate years being combined together. Okay, so we haven't done a whole lot of pivoting yet. Well, let's do some pivoting. When we talk about pivot tables, kind of the implication is we're turning our data in different directions to kind of see what's what. One key way that we can do that is by dragging these fields around, which we have done a little bit. We drag the years up here. But let's say, for example, I want this same data, but I don't want it in this format. I could say, for instance, take the country field and drag it over under rows. If I do that, well, if I do just that, it's going to give me an interesting result. I have 3 sets of rows once again. The main rows are a country row, so I have Canada, and then I have the total for Canada, right? And then I have quarter rows underneath those, and then I have January, February, and March. Again, my years are set on all. Let's actually change that. I'll go up here and switch to 2018. Click OK. There we go. So now I can see like the data from Canada in 2018, and then when I scroll down, I have a US row with a sub-row for each quarter and a sub-row for each month. So all of that's, all that's fine, but it's a little cramped and you have to scroll a lot. So let's take this stuff and put it over here. I'm going to take the quarters field and I'm going to drop it under columns. And I'm going to take the date field and I'm going to drop it under that. So now what we have is we have 2 big sets of columns, or 2 sets of columns, right? So the first set of columns is each quarter. So there's the quarter 1 column right here, the quarter 2 column right here, the quarter 3 column, and the quarter 4 column. And then we have a grand total column as well. But then, whoops, what just happened? Okay, I double-clicked on something. I had no idea it would do that. That's very interesting. I'm going to have to look into that later. But so I've got my and then I have the sub rows underneath those, 1 for each month of the quarter, right? So and then each row. So each column, the sub columns are 1 for each month of the quarter, and then the rows are the countries, Canada and the US. So let's see, what else could we do? We could add, let's say that I'll take the quarters out of here for now. We don't necessarily need that. It's not adding a lot to the picture. So we'll just leave it as January, February, March, April. Let's say that I also want to see it broken down by salesperson. I'm going to come up here and grab the salesperson field. I'm going to drag that down and put it we'll put it at the top first, and then we'll see what difference it makes when we put it at the bottom. So if I put the salesperson at the top, what it's going to do is it's going to show me the one salesperson's name. So in this case, Cassius is our first salesperson listed out. And then these are Cassius's totals from both countries, Canada and the US, for 2018, because of course we have it filtered out. We're only showing 2018 data. So these are the totals from both countries for Cassius. But then, the sub rows underneath Cassius's name are the countries. So we have a sub row for Canada, and out of this $696,610.60, 30,000 of it came from Canada, and ominously, 666,000 of it came from the US. So now we can see the individual performance for each salesperson. If we want to, though, we can flip this. Let's say that we're looking more at how different people do in different, in the two countries. I'm going to take the country column or row, the country field, third time's the charm, and I'm going to drag it to the top above where it says salesperson. And now what we have is we have a country row, and then we have sub rows for each salesperson. So in Canada, we have, in January 2018, total amount that everybody made in January 2018 was $455,343,000.60. But then out of that, 30,000 and some odd, or 31,000-ish came from Cassius, 351,000-ish came from Ray, and then 73,000-ish came from Sean. So we can now see, okay, well, who's contributing to what totals, in the country. And then down here we can see what was their revenue in the US instead of Canada. So it all depends, the way you arrange your pivot tables all depends on what kind of data you're trying to pull out, right? Are you looking for some sort of pattern? What are you trying to find out? Like, how the salespeople are doing relative to each other, how the salespeople are doing in one country versus another, how much revenue you're bringing in each month overall, how do the months compare to each other, all sorts of different things like that you might be wanting to do. And basically, you just play around with the pivot table until you get it to show you that data. Drag fields back and forth. If you want to remove a field, all you have to do is drag it up here and drop it in the list, and then it's gone. You want it back, grab it from the list, drag it back down, there it is again. So it's fun to just play around with it and see what you get and see what you can find out, see what sorts of patterns emerge from your data as you're tinkering with your pivot table. But one other thing you can do if you're kind of stumped, which sometimes we all are, of course, is you can come up to the Pivot Table Tools Analyze tab, and you can click on Recommended Pivot Tables. When you do that, it's going to look at what kind of data you have, and it's going to give you some suggestions of how you might arrange your pivot table and allow you to easily do that with a couple of clicks. So let's say, for example, here's sum of amount by salesperson and country. That's the first suggestion. Sum of amount by salesperson. Let's see. Sum of number of items by salesperson and country. Ooh, that reminds me of one bit that I forgot. I'll circle back to that in a sec. Count of order number by salesperson and country. Let's actually do this one. So count of order number by salesperson and country. In other words, this is how many orders were placed. Well, let's just look at it. I'll click OK to reconfigure to that. And it's going to shuffle all my stuff around. Filters are cleared out. Country is in my columns area. So I have a Canada column and the US column. That's familiar. And then I have a salesperson, and then I have salesperson rows here, one for each salesperson. Then I have count of order number. I'm not crazy about it being count of order number versus count of amount, but it doesn't really matter that much. Actually, I am going to go ahead and put amount back down here under values. It should give us the same numbers, and I'm going to drag count of order number out. So now it gives us sum of amount. So this is going to actually show, because it says sum rather than count, this is going to actually show us how much money we made from each order, or from the total orders. So Sean's order total altogether was $339,807 in Canada over the 2 years that we're tracking this. But let's say that I want to switch it back to kind of see the information that we had before. I'm going to go down here where it says sum of amount, click on that and click value field settings. And that's going to give us this dialog box again. In this dialog box, we have sum of amount, which is the default, but I could also do count, average, maximum, minimum, product, and count numbers. And each of these is going to give me a different result. But let me show you what count is actually doing. I'm going to click on count, click OK. What that's going to do is look for each row where there's something in the amount column. And that should be all of them for these orders. And it's going to see, OK, who was the salesperson and what country was the order in. So now, by looking at this, I can tell Sean did a total of 4 orders in Canada and 23 orders in the US. Ray did 28 orders in Canada and 76 orders in the US, and so on and so forth. So I can tell right off the bat, okay, well, this is how, so I can see how many orders they're processing versus the dollar amount of the orders, which could give me, a different type of information that could be useful in a different way. Let's say I change the value field settings again and I go average. When I click OK, what it's going to do, again, it's going to look at that, it's going to look at my total, or it's going to look at the amount that each customer paid for each order, and it's going to break it down by our columns and rows. So in this case, I can see that Madeline, for example, had, let's see, $102,542.99. That was the average cost of her Canada orders over the course of the 2 years of data that we're looking at here. So, so that could be really useful, like, your average order is X number of dollars or Y number of dollars, and you could talk to your salespeople about that and say, good job, or this needs work, or whatever. So there's a lot of stuff you can do with pivot tables, and it definitely pays to just play around and see what works best for you. Okay, now that we've got this, let's go ahead and talk about pivot charts really quickly. Ooh, we're running a little low on time, so I want to try and... The pivot charts are not super duper involved because we've already seen how regular charts work. It's very similar. So we're not going to belabor the point with that, but I definitely want you to see it. So up here at the top in the ribbon, under the Pivot Table Tools Analyze tab, we have this Pivot Chart button. I'm going to click on that. And when I do, I get the Charts dialog box that pops up pretty much just like we had back in part 2, at the end of part 2. And I can choose from a whole host of different chart options that I might want. So let's see, what's a good fit for this data here? Okay, clustered column, that seems fine, the one that it started out with. I'll leave it as that. There are other variations, but this one's good. I'll click OK. And now I have this data that came from my pivot table represented on this chart. So I can see, so it's the average of the amount, right? The average of how much each person's order, how much revenue we brought in for each person's order. So Cassius's average here was, was a little over 100,000 in the US and in Canada, both. Ray's average order was higher. She's almost at 1,100 in terms of her average US order, and she's almost at, excuse me, she's almost at 110,000 as her average order for the US, and she's almost at 120,000 for the average order from Canada. So that's an easy way to represent this. And of course, when you do that, when you create a pivot chart, you get yet another tab up here, or you get 3 tabs. You get the Pivot Chart Tools Analyze tab, Pivot Chart Tools Design tab, so you can change the look of it if you want to, you know, make it a little 3D or give it little data callouts or whatever you want to do. And then there's the Pivot Chart Tools Format, where you can change colors and all those kinds of things. You can move your chart to a different sheet, which you probably will want to do. If you click Move Chart, you know, you can create a new sheet or you can move it to an existing one. Just depends on what you want to do. And you can even use these little buttons. If you click on one of these, oh, I guess not that one, but if you click on this little drop-down arrow, you can filter based on who the salesperson is. You can filter based on the country, or you can sort based on those as well. So that's it for pivot tables and pivot charts. What questions do y'all have for me before we move on to talking about the Vlookup function and our last example? How do I get the average of the amount? I'll show you. So, okay, I'm going to just get rid of this chart for a sec so I can show you on the pivot table. It's pretty easy once you see it. So down here, so I had the amount field. When I drag the amount field down here, what it starts out with is sum of amount rather than average of amount. I clicked on sum of amount and I clicked value field settings. Then I came over here in my value field settings dialog box, and I changed the setting from sum up here to average by clicking on that. And then I just clicked OK. By the way, if I wanted to change it so it looked like dollar amounts again, I'll just go number format, currency, OK, and then OK. So now I actually get dollar amounts for the averages. So yeah, that's all I did. All right. Excellent. I don't see any other questions yet. If you're typing a question, feel free to keep typing. But we'll go ahead and move on to our last example here. Okay, so for the last example, we're going to actually use 2 different sheets. We're going to use the sheet that's labeled this year and the sheet that's labeled last year down at the bottom. Oh, let me get my ribbon back so that I have all my tools and stuff. Beautiful. Okay, so in this example, I'm putting on some sort of a little get-together. I'm inviting the same people that I invited last year, and I happen to know none of their contact information has changed, thank goodness. So really, all I need to do is as they RSVP with me, I need to fill their information in the new spreadsheet, and I need to find out what their meal preferences are and then learn from the hotel what their room number is going to be, so I can have all that information close to hand as I'm planning. But for the contact information, the name, the address, the phone number, and the email address, I want to actually just carry that information over from the sheet that I used last year. And that's the one that's labeled last year. In order to do that, first of all, there is one thing that I went ahead and preset for us. You'll notice if I click, cancel. If I click in cell or anywhere in column A, you'll notice I get a drop-down arrow. When I click on the drop-down arrow, then I get the names of the people that are listed over there on the last year sheet. I did that with data validation before, as I was setting up the example file, because that's going to make it a little bit easier to sort of to to do this example because we don't have to worry about typos or remembering what the people's names are when we're flipping back and forth between sheets. So, okay, I'm going to select a name up here. Let's say Sakiko Herod. And then over here in column B, in cell B2, I'm going to select that cell. And I'm going to write a formula that's going to grab Sakiko Herod's address and drop it into cell B2 here without me having to go and look it up and copy it manually and paste it and all that annoying stuff. So here's what I'm going to do. I've selected cell B2. I'll go up to the top, click in the formula bar, and hit the equal sign to tell Excel to expect a formula. Just like we've been talking about all week, whenever you write a formula, it always starts with an equal sign. Whenever you put anything else in a cell in Excel, it should never start with an equal sign. So I've got my equal sign there. Then what I'm going to do is use this new function that I'm about to tell you about, which is Vlookup, all one word. So V for vertical, by the way, look up, just like that. And you should see it pop up right here in this little hint suggestion system at the bottom. You can't like press enter and fill that in, unfortunately, but it'll help you at least make sure that you're typing the name of the function correctly. If you see that disappear when you're typing the name of a function, you know you messed up and you've got a typo in there somewhere. Okay, so next to the name of the function VLOOKUP, I'm going to do Shift 9 to add a left parenthesis there. And then I'm being prompted for 4 arguments. Now remember, arguments are the pieces of information that a function like VLOOKUP needs to use in order to do its job, basically. If you told Excel to add something, of course, you've got to give it some numbers that you want it to add together. So, so that's what we're going to do in this case. So VLOOKUP, my left parenthesis here, and then my 4 arguments that I'm being prompted for. The first one is lookup value. So what Excel is going to do, let's just talk about what this VLOOKUP function does, and then we'll talk about how we're going to make it do it. So what the VLOOKUP function does specifically is it gets some sort of information and it goes to another part of your workbook and it finds a match for that information. So in this case, we're going to get the name Sakiko Herod, and we're going to go, Excel is going to go look for it somewhere else where we tell it to look. If it finds a match for that name, then it's going to look to the right of that, and it's going to bring back another piece of information from a different column on that same row. In this case, we want it to be Sakiko Herod's address from column B over there on the other sheet, the last year sheet. So our lookup value is the thing that it's going to try and find a match for. And of course, that's the name, in this case, Sakiko Herod, which is in cell A2. So I'll just type A2, and again, you'll notice it's color-coded in blue up here, and it's color-coded in blue down here to show me I'm pointing to the right cell. Okay, next, comma. So I'll put the comma to tell Excel, okay, A2 is the first argument. We're done with that. That's our lookup value. Next, we're telling it where to look for a match for Sakiko Herod's name. And where we want it to look is certain cells on that last year sheet, right? So unfortunately, we can, but it would be difficult to manually enter that information and tell Excel exactly where to look. So we're not going to do that. Instead, we're going to do it the easy way, which is always nice. And here's what I'm going to do. Now, watch carefully what I'm about to do because it's a little weird. And at some point this week, you may have done it by accident, but I want to show you how to do it on purpose now. Okay, so we've still got our cursor blinking away up here ready for us to type something, right? To continue typing our formula. But we don't want to keep typing the formula. We want to have Excel fill in the place where we want we want it to look for Sakiko Herod's name. So here's what we're going to do. I'm going to come down and I'm going to, while the cursor is still blinking, make sure you don't hit escape or press enter or any of that stuff. While the cursor is still blinking up here in the formula bar or down here in cell B2 if you are typing it, the formula down there, click on the last year sheet. When you do, you'll notice the formula stays up there, but we've added apostrophe, last year, apostrophe, exclamation point. So that tells Excel, okay, I'm about to reference some cells, but the cells are not on this sheet that you're on, formula. The cells are on another sheet in the workbook, and I'm about to tell you which ones. So that's the last year sheet. Then I'm going to come down here and I'm going to select cells A2, which has the first name Andy Wong, down to cell D11, which has the email address speakfriend@eglinc.info. And that, because this is where all my data is that I'm going to be reusing, the names, the addresses, the phone numbers, and the email addresses. Otherwise, these two columns here you could include, but we're not going to copy their information over onto the other sheet, so I'm not going to include them. Okay, so when I dragged from A2 to D11, it actually filled that in, A2:D11. Beautiful, I didn't even have to type it. So now what I'm going to do is put a comma after that, and I'm going to put in my column index number is what it's asking me for. What, pray tell, is a column index number, you may be asking? And that is a very good question. A column index number is kind of weird. Basically, the way it works is, so we have this table array, these cells from A2 to D11 that we just selected, the cells where Excel is going to be looking for Sakiko Herod's name and bringing us back information. We've got that table array, and then just to the right, of the names in the second column from the left is our addresses. That's what we're looking for. We want it to bring back this address specifically. So what our column index number does is basically it's just a count from left to right of which of the columns until, it's just a count from left to right until we get to the column where we have the information we want to bring back. So in this case, the addresses. So my column index number is 2. The reason for that is the addresses are in the second column from the left in my table array. Now the reason this is weird is you would think, well, why don't you just put B there? Well, the table array could start anywhere. Your table array could start in column E or column I or whatever. And it could be a bunch of rows. If it did start in, say, column E and I wanted information from column F, my column index number would also be 2 because E is the leftmost column and F is the second to leftmost column. I'm just counting over the number of columns until I get to the one with the information that I want. So the column index number is not 2 because B is the second letter in the alphabet. It's 2 because column A is the first column from the left in my table array, and column B is the second column from the left. A little weird, but you'll get the hang of it with a little bit of practice. So that's my column index number. And then we have range lookup, or excuse me, actually I need to put a comma after that. And then we have our range lookup optional argument here. So by default, Excel will, so basically if you choose true here, what Excel is going to do is it's going to look for an approximate match. If it finds something that it considers to be close enough to Sakiko Herod, it's going to bring back that person's address. And if there's a possibility of typos and things like that, that might be useful. However, I usually find Excel doesn't do a great job of figuring out what's an approximate match and what's an exact match. So sometimes it'll bring you back the wrong information, in my experience. So I always put false here instead. And false forces Excel to choose or to look for an exact match rather than settling for an approximate match. So all I'm going to do is just type false right here. And I recommend you always do false as well. And then I'm going to do Shift 0 to close my parentheses. I've written my whole formula, and now I can just hit the check mark or press enter or whatever. Okay, so Megan, your question, let's see. Yeah, is it because it's immediately to the right of the name column, or is it because it's the second column from the first column? Like, what if there were a column before the names? Okay, yes, that's a great question. So let's say, I'm just going to duplicate this so that you can see it. So I'm going to right-click on the sheet, move or copy, move to end, create a copy. Okay, so now I have a duplicate version of this to play around with. Okay, so if we were still looking for, let's say there was another column for, title or something, and then we had like CEO and stuff. Okay, so we've got another column here. If the VLOOKUP, or if I'm trying to tell Excel, okay, look, basically the answer to your question depends on what you're trying to do with the formula. So assuming we were trying to do the exact same thing, we were trying to take the name and look up the address, but you had another column over here, and you wanted that included in the table array, the column index number would be 3 instead of 2. So it doesn't have to do with where you're finding which column you're finding the data in. It has to do with just strictly which column's the leftmost, which column's the second leftmost, which column's the third leftmost. But if I were, if I were choosing something for the title, like if I were searching for the title instead, and then looking up the address from that, it would also be 3 for the same reason. Great question. Thank you so much. That's wonderful. Okay, so let's check on our results here. In this year sheet, we now have our formula there, and it looks like it's working. 7356 Blue Sky Pike. Let's make sure that's the right address. Totally is. So our formula is working properly. However, it's not working properly, which I'm about to show you. So let's say that I'm going to take the little dot here, click and drag on it, drag it on down so that I get a bunch of copies of this formula. It is going to give me the little not applicable. I could use logical functions like we did yesterday to make it not show this not applicable, but I'm not going to because we're not going to spend the time on that. Okay, so let's say that I go down here and I choose another name. Let's say Andy Wong. Click on that. Wah, wah, wah. My formula is not working. The reason for that is that Andy Wong's name, let's look at the way the formula worked out. So VLOOKUP A7 is my lookup value. The name, that's correct. So yeah, A7, that's the right cell. Then we've got last year in apostrophes and an exclamation point. That tells Excel, okay, table array, it's over on that other sheet that's called last year. Check it out. But then our table array has been changed by Excel when I copied the formula down. Our table array now says A7 to D16, so those row numbers have changed. And when I go over and look at A7 to D16, that's these cells right here. Now, if I chose someone whose name was later in the list, it would actually still work on this row. But since I chose Andy's name at the very top, it's not going to work. I'm going to go back to the this year sheet then, and I'm going to fix this problem. So the easiest way to do that, of course, we could make it absolute. So I could change it to last year, exclamation point, apostrophe, and then $A, $7, $D, $16. Could totally do that. It's not a problem to do that. But the easier way is to name it instead. So I'm going to come up here and I'm going to select cells A2 to D11 again. Make sure you're not editing a formula for this one. So cell A2 to D11, I'm going to select those by dragging, and then I'm going to come up here to the name box where it says A2, and I'm going to rename this old info. So I'll just type old info, press enter, and there it is. Now this whole range of cells, A2 to D11, has been renamed old info. And then I'm going to go back to the this year sheet, and on the this year sheet, I'm going to click cell B2, and I'm going to change this formula. So I'm going to come up here, click in the formula, use my arrow keys to move down a little bit, and then everything from the apostrophe last year, apostrophe, exclamation point, down to D11, I'm going to get rid of all that stuff. So I should have VLOOKUP A2, or parenthesis A2, comma, and then old info. I'm just going to type it in, and in fact, it's suggesting it to me down there at the bottom. So I'm going to type old info, and then I have comma 2, and then comma false. I'll press enter on my keyboard, and this one still works. Good, that's what we wanted. Now, though, I'm going to double click the dot, and that one works too. Fantastic. And if I go down here, I can even select some of the other ones, and those work as well. However, we still have a couple of tweaks to make to get our phone number and email address. Not big tweaks, just little ones. If I were to copy this one over into column C, suddenly I'm going to end up with, come on now. I'm going to end up with not applicable again. The reason for that is now it's looking at B2, and then our column index number is 2. So we're like, look for a match for 7356 Blue Sky Pike, and then bring back the same thing, because that's what's in that column on that, or on that row in that column. So that's not going to work. What we need to do instead is change it. Number one, we need to change it so that B2 is A2. So we're looking, again, we're looking for a match for the name rather than the address in the column C version of the formula. But then over here, we need to change our column index number from 2 to 3. Okay, yeah. Somebody's saying they've got to go. Let me really quickly, yeah, I'm sorry we ran a little long. Let me really quickly give you that information. So if you want to go back and watch any of the sessions, they are all on the CAL's YouTube channel, which just crossed the threshold of 1,000 subscribers. Very exciting. And you too can be part of it. If you go to cals.link/YouTube, and I'm going to put that in Zoom chat as well as YouTube and YouTube chat and Facebook comments. If you go to cals.link/YouTube, you can go to the CAL's YouTube channel, like and subscribe and all the stuff, but you can also find all of these sessions recorded there. So feel free to check that out anytime, and that way you can catch up, or if you miss something at the end, that sort of thing, you can circle back to it. We're not going to have much more of this, though. Good question. Thank you so much for asking. Glad I went ahead and dropped that in there. Okay, so that's this version of the formula. So now, so one other thing I could do to make this more copyable is I could go ahead and make the A2, the A in A2, absolute. So I'll add a $ in front of the A. So now when I copy it over into other columns, it's still going to look in column A. I'll drag it over here. And then, whoops, I forgot. I got to change my column index number again. And then I'll drag this one over. This way. And there we go. Now we have our phone number. So all we need to do now is change that one again to be column index number 4. And then if we want it on the rest of these in the rest of these rows, we'll just select both these cells and double click on the little dot to flash fill it down. And now we have a version of the formula on every row. And that's it. You did it. This was Excel Part 4. It's the last session of the week. Thank you so much, everybody, particularly those of you who are here every day or even some of the days. I'm so glad that you are here. I love teaching this course, and it will happen again. If you want a refresher, of course, you can download, you can head to the same place, to that Excel 4 files link. I'll go ahead and drop that back in. You can head to that link, cals.link/excel-4-files. You can head there. You can download the example file from this session and the handout from this session, and you can download the example files and handouts from all the other sessions over in the sidebar when you go there as well. We're doing tons of other classes. Head to cals.org and click on events, or head to events and click on technology classes to see what else we're doing. Microsoft Word is next month, and a bunch of other stuff. Six Bridges Book Festival is coming up. We're gonna have a ton of cool events there, including events that we will live stream on the YouTube channel and the Facebook page, and we'll be hosting some in Zoom as well. Man, I hope y'all have a fantastic rest of the day. Any last questions before we wrap it up? Fantastic. Thank you, Megan. I really appreciate you being here the whole time. All right. Y'all have yourselves a fantastic rest of the day and a good weekend starting tomorrow. See you next time.